Well, thank you so much to you all for joining us this evening. Maybe if we just start off with some introductory remarks. Would you like to go first?
Maybe Mary can go first. I'm Elise Hogue. I'm the president of an organization called NARAL, which was formed in 1969, so we'll be 50 years old next year. And when it was formed, it was called the National Association to Repeal Abortion Laws, because this was 4 years prior to abortion laws being repealed in the United States. Now it's actually the National Abortion Rights Action League. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. You all are very esteemed. And so, but it's really truly an honor and a privilege to be here with Anne and Sinead, because in America, we're certainly looking at what's going on over here. We feel as though we're moving backwards. It's a frightening time for women in general in the United States. Certainly the attacks on abortion access as well as contraception are at the peak that they've been since abortion was legalized in 1973. And it's coming at the same time as we're having massive issues with sexual harassment and sexual predation in the United States. And so for us, we feel quite vulnerable in the United States. We see a lot of connection and hope in what's going on over here. And we are really seeking to draw the connections globally to what women are going through, but also within our own country to, I don't know if you all saw, but Steve Bannon called the emerging movement in the United States one that will supersede the Tea Party in terms of its desire to overthrow the patriarchy. And that is actually quite true. And we're very proud of that. But, it feels as though we are really at a precipice in the United States. And for us, abortion rights is really increasingly seen as sort of the nucleus of gender equity, which is something that we've continued to struggle with well beyond the liberalization of abortion. We were never able to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed in the United States. So, the fact that the referendum is coming in Ireland now is a beacon of light for those of us who are the next generation fighting this in the United States and realizing how much is on the line.
Thank you. Anne?
Hi, similarly honoured to be here with Elise and Sinead. My name's Anne Farady. I run a British Pregnancy Advisory Service, which is a non-profit organisation. We're a charity. We provide about 70,000 abortions a year at clinics throughout Britain. Most of the procedures that we do are paid for by the National Health Service. Some are paid for by women themselves, typically women who've travelled to come to Britain from other countries. Women travel mainly from Northern Ireland, and they can now get their procedures paid for by the government here, which is a very new move, and I think is significant because it demonstrates that the government is taking seriously its responsibility to provide services for women in Northern Ireland on an equal basis to those in the rest of the United Kingdom. But for women in the south of Ireland, in the Republic, they're still having to fund their own procedures, but I'll leave that to Sinead to talk about. In Britain, I think we're in a really strange situation because we're operating under a law that is 50 years old this year. And one of the big differences between the United States and Britain is that in the United States, abortion was seen as being part of a woman's right to privacy, for a decision for her to take by herself. It was kind of felt that by being private, it was something that was out with the state. It was something that you decided in your family for yourself. In Britain, in the 1960s, abortion was seen as a public health measure. And if you look at the grounds for abortion in this country, it's kind of weird because your experience, if you need to access our services, is that you will be able to have an abortion pretty much at your request. But that's because the doctor that you see will appreciate that denying you an abortion will be bad for your mental health, and that to compel a woman to have a child that she doesn't want is going to be damaging to her health, because abortion in this country is legal on health grounds, not as a matter of right. And so it's really, you have to have two doctors who will agree with that health decision. And I think times are really changing here, because I think that there are people who will argue that the health grounds are in some ways what's protected us against the growth of an anti-abortion movement, as you see in the United States, because it's much more difficult for people who are opposed to abortion to interfere with a doctor's decision that it's the best thing for a woman patient. Whereas when it's an issue of rights, it's much more contested. But frankly, I think that women in this country have had enough of being patronized by doctors, well, patronized by the state and enabled by doctors to make decisions which really should be a matter for them, matter of choice, because we know that the reason why you need an abortion is generally because your contraception's failed, or sometimes we fail to use it as well as we should. So now the lobby movement here is really to bring our abortion from the 1960s to the 21st century and to decriminalize abortion, and that's what we're really arguing for. And who knows, it may very well be the case that in Ireland we end up with a decision that might even cause our politicians to have a rethink about where popular opinion is right now.
Oh, wouldn't that be something? So thank you very much. It's also a great pleasure to be here with Elise and Anne tonight. My name is Sinead Kennedy. I'm the secretary of the Coalition to Repeal the Eighth Amendment, which is a coalition of organisations. We're about over 100 different organisations, campaigning organisations, activists, civil society, political parties, a group of people, a group of different organisations who've come together. I think when we estimated, we represent, I think collectively, over 1.5 million people in Ireland who have one goal, and that is to repeal the Eighth Amendment. And the Eighth Amendment was introduced into Ireland in 1983, and it is a constitutional ban, a constitutional prohibition on abortion. So it basically states, it's 42 words in the Irish Constitution. I mightn't get it exactly right, but it states that the state acknowledges the right to life of the unborn, this is the term that's used, and with due regard to the equal right to life of the mother, guarantees by its laws to protect and vindicate that right. And those 42 words have essentially meant that abortion is illegal in almost all circumstances in Ireland, except if the pregnant woman's life is at risk. And it has resulted in a pretty horrific situation for a lot of women, particularly women who cannot afford to travel and access abortion in Britain. And I suppose despite the historic differences between our two countries, Britain has provided a safe haven for Irish women, and particularly grateful to Anne and her organisation BPAS, who have provided abortions for Irish women who have travelled abroad. And we know that since the 1983 referendum, over 170,000 Irish women have travelled to access abortion, mainly in Britain, but in some other European countries. What Irish abortion law is, it's almost like the kind of embodiment of hypocrisy, because what it says is you cannot have, you are constitutionally prevented from having an abortion in Ireland, but the Constitution guarantees that you have the right to travel outside to have an abortion. So in other words, we don't care if you have an abortion as long as you don't have one in Ireland. It is the embodiment of hypocrisy, if you like. And what it means is, one, if you have the money to travel abroad to Britain, you can access abortion. Or two, if you have the ability to travel, because it assumes that everybody has a visa, that everybody is physically able to travel, that everybody has the financial resources to travel to Britain. And it has effectively created a two-tier system. Those that have the money and the ability and means can travel abroad, and those that can't. I think Mara Clark from the Abortion Support Network, which is a charity here, says, I think put it very succinctly when she said that women and couples with money have choices, women and couples without money have babies. Increasingly in the last couple of years, women who cannot travel have sought to access abortion in Ireland using the abortion pill, sites like womenhelp.org or Women on Web. But they also do so under the sanction of a criminal penalty, which means that you face a prison sentence of up to 14 years. So having an abortion in Ireland means that you are a criminal. Now, one of the, I think, the very encouraging things that has happened in the last couple of years is that there has been this amazing movement, really led by people like yourselves, by young women, who have, I think, led this wonderfully, at times spontaneous, creative, energetic movement that has finally, just a couple of weeks ago, forced the government to agree to a referendum. So we are facing into a referendum campaign. We don't have an exact date, but we think towards the end of May, which will give the Irish electorate the opportunity to repeal this Eighth Amendment from the Constitution and to introduce a more compassionate abortion regime in Ireland that respects women, that respects their lives, their health, and ultimately their choices, that it is not up to the state, the church, or anybody else. It is a private decision between a woman and her doctor. And we're going to be campaigning in the coming weeks and months. I wouldn't like to overstate it, but I do think that we have a very good, we're facing into a real possibility for the first time, I think, in a generation to achieve that autonomy and respect for women living in Ireland.
Thank you. So I guess my first question is mainly aimed at Sinead, but kind of broadens out to the panellists as well. What do you think have been the main challenges of the Repeal the Eighth, that face the Repeal the Eighth movement? And I guess more broadly to the rest of the panel, what do you think are the main challenges that face anyone who's an activist within the abortion rights kind of area?
Well, I suppose the main challenge for us has really been to put it onto the political agenda. I think it has been on the popular agenda, particularly for the last couple of years. Every year, towards the end of September, on International Decriminalisation of Abortion Day, there's a March for Choice. It's now in its 6th year, and tens of thousands of people organise on that particular day and all around it. And there is, there's huge levels of support and activism around the country. There's lots of different networks to help and support women to access abortion. But really until recently, politicians have refused to really engage with it. They've come up with various techniques to sort of kick the can, anything other than actually grasping the nettle. So that for us has been the real challenge, is to try and put it onto the political agenda. And I think that finally we have begun now to kind of make some inroads into that, and we now have even quite conservative political parties saying that they will support repeal. So but that has been, I think, the biggest challenge.
Our challenge is to keep it off the political agenda. It's. I think from our perspective, the challenge has been predominantly around abortion stigma and the idea that even in America, even where abortion has been legal, surely you've done something wrong if you have to avail yourself of abortion. And I spoke about my own abortion at the Democratic National Convention from the stage, which is not ever on one's bucket list to actually get up and share your most personal stories with, 2 million of your best friends. But it felt important because of the critical juncture that we're at in our country. And one of the things I said in my speech was, that the other side would have you believe that there are good girls who have families and bad girls who have abortions, and the reality is we're the same women at different times in our lives making the decisions that are best for us. And because of the deep, deep stigma around abortion that has persisted, even though it has been legal for a long time, we've sort of had this posture as a pro-choice movement that, we'll compromise with the other side, right? And so we'll agree that if you don't like abortion, we'll work with you on contraception, because what lowers the rates of abortion, but, good access to contraception. Well, the reality is they don't like contraception. And in the United States, which will be very foreign to you all, but those same people are actually the ones who tried to pull health insurance from poor children. We have no paid family leave, and our prenatal care is terrible unless you have money in the United States. So we're really challenging them, and this has been a silver lining on, okay, we tried to compromise, and you all want to call yourself pro-life, but actually your agenda is anything but pro-life. It's about punishing women no matter what our choices are. And so, I think that does gain us some traction, but we are now fighting to dig ourselves out of a hole. Even though abortion is legal and right, as we were discussing before the panel, there are huge swaths of the country, much larger than the UK, where it's basically inaccessible. And the other side, particularly because they're sort of feeling at the zenith of their power, is enacting all sorts of laws that I hope would be unthinkable here, but there's laws that say a woman can't access abortion unless her partner or husband signs off on it, and if you can't identify who that is, then it's your father or your male next of kin. There was recently a law passed in Montana, in a particular county in Montana, that required pregnant women to self-report for enhanced state monitoring. And so it's, as I said in my introductory comments, it's both if we can surface the real conversation, which is that in our country, the other side has never been predominantly anti-abortion, right? If they were, they would work with us to have options that reduce the unintended pregnancy and provide for poor and working moms to have a shot at having a family, but they don't do any of that. They are really truly about controlling women and imposing a version of what they believe is a very biblical definition of family. And that, I hope the more we have that conversation openly, we will actually find more people willing to speak up about the right to abortion as part of this rubric of things that we value very highly in the United States, like self-determination and autonomy and being in charge of one's own destiny. But we've got some distance to travel.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're trying to keep it off the political agenda, you're trying to get it on the political agenda. We're trying to change the way it's on the political agenda, which has been kind of weird because, as I say, the situation in Britain has been really kind of quite stable for quite a long time, but the argument has typically, all of the the bills, all of the attempts to change the law have really come from people who are trying to restrict it and to make the point that abortion is a problem. And I think that that is very much where the moral discussion has sat, that abortion is somehow morally wrong, it's a problem, and the pro-choice side has actually been quite defensive a lot of the time in basically saying, yeah, well, regardless of what you think about it, morally, we need it. So the point is, it's almost become a, well, maybe it's wrong, but contraception fails, we kind of need it as a backstop. And I think what we've really realized is that discussion does not adequately balance what we really need, because, you know, it's all very well being concerned about the relative rights of the embryo and so on, but who says that when a woman becomes pregnant, she loses rights over her own body and over her ability to decide where her future is going? And you raised, Elise, a really, I think, two really important points about autonomy and about women's self-determination. And I think we have really got to fight very hard now to shift and make that central to the agenda, because I have no problems in according value to the embryo and the fetus and so on. I'm very happy to say that, you know, these are wonderful beginnings of life, but I just don't accord them as much value as I would accord to the woman who's carrying them. And so let's start saying there's something inviolable about women's decisions over their future and see that somehow enshrined in law, which is why we would like to see abortion taken out of the criminal law, because it has no place there. It should be regarded technically as a medical procedure to be regulated in the same way that other medical procedures are regulated. Morally, it's for a woman herself in her own private circumstances to decide whether she should or not avail herself of that. So it's a different kind of political discussion I think we need to have.
Thank you. So kind of touching upon the issue of the barrier of when an abortion is kind of acceptable and when it's not, where are kind of the panel stances on the matter of kind of weeks, or do you think it's kind of the whole range, or where would you kind of go with that?
Shall I kick off on that? You know, I mean, look, right, so we provide abortions up to 24 weeks of pregnancy, which is kind of our legal limit here. And I can honestly tell you that the most difficult thing is when a woman has presented and she's 24 weeks and 3 days, or 24 weeks and 1 day, telling her that it would now be completely illegal for us to provide her with a procedure that, had she been in the clinic 3 days earlier, we could have provided quite legally. And I think when people talk about time limits, somehow there's this image pops into people's minds of women who are like 35 weeks, 39 weeks pregnant, who are desperate to have abortions on the cusp of giving birth. But actually it's not like that. It's really about, I think it's about looking at the woman's circumstances and allowing for her to come to a decision about whether she can continue the pregnancy, and actually a doctor also feeling competent and able to enable her to have that procedure. And I don't see who else's business it is. It's like, you might think it's wrong, but you don't have to live with the decision. The woman does. Actually, the doctor kind of does in a different way, so let them make a decision about it. So I would like to see that as the law, but I think it's framed so that late abortions are seen now as being unacceptable and early abortions are seen as being kind of okay. But in real women's lives, women don't think of themselves as being, am I 12 weeks, am I 16 weeks, am I 20 weeks? And besides which, stuff changes, which means that your wanted pregnancy, you know, suddenly becomes a problem, like the guy leaves. You know, and you're stuck on your own, and that's a different thing altogether.
Yeah, our Supreme Court ruled on this in 1973, and what they said is pre-viability, it is the woman's decision, and post-viability, it's really not legal unless you get two different doctors to say that there is a significant medical reason. We get asked about weeks a lot. The reason that the Supreme Court ruled on viability and not specific weeks is because viability is different for different women. You know, I happen to be the mother of Gloria's twins. So my twins were not viable at the same time as somebody carrying, they would not have lived outside of the womb at the same time somebody carrying a single child. And that's a medical determination and should be left to medical experts. But we do have this, you know, we just had legislation up in our Congress to ban abortion federally at 20 weeks. Now, many, many states have already banned abortion at 20 weeks, which means, you know, if you happen to be in a state where one of those bans is in place, you either have the money to travel to a different state where you might be able to get the procedure or you don't. And there are a couple different things about that. That is a very, very small percentage of abortions in the United States. It's about 1.5%. Almost no woman wakes up 5 months pregnant and is like, oh, what did I forget to do? There was something there, you know. For the most part, these are actually medical situations where something dramatic has changed, shifted in the diagnosis of either the fetus or the mother, or life circumstances have dramatically changed. And we just had a study published, which I'm quite sure Anne is familiar with, called the Turnaway Study, and it did track those women who show up at 20 weeks and then the day after. And one of the things about the United States is the majority of women in the United States who seek abortion care are already mothers trying to take care of the families that they have. And in the Turnaway Study, what they found is that the women who were turned away were much more likely to lose custody of the children that they already had, continue to live in poverty, lose their jobs. And so, again, like Anne said, it's really neither in the interest of the state nor ethical for the state to make those decisions. The last thing I will say, though, interestingly, is because states in the United States are making it so difficult and putting up so many barriers to access, even early in pregnancy. You are now seeing more women pushed later into pregnancy, whereas if it was accessible in the first 12 weeks, they would certainly avail themselves within the first 12 weeks. But if you live in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas or in parts of Indiana, you have to get money together to travel, find childcare, take time off your job and still continue to pay your rent, and it's pushing the procedures later and later in pregnancy. So ironically, the things that the anti-choice movement says they're most against is what they're actually causing to happen now in the United States, which gets back to the point of what are they really against in the first place.
Just to clarify, so I'm part of the coalition and we do support repeal of the Eighth Amendment, which is just to repeal the prohibition on abortion. I just want to be clear because I am facing into a referendum campaign. And what the Irish government then will propose will be something along the lines of a period on request up to about 12 weeks. After that, a period that will protect women's health women's lives and in cases of fatal abnormality. So that is probably likely to be what Ireland's abortion law will look like and what we in the coalition support. I'm now talking about my personal opinion, okay, not the opinion of the coalition. So I agree very much with what Anne and Elisa have argued. I think sometimes we get asked this an awful lot in discussions on abortion about what week do you support abortion up to is usually the kind of first question that you get thrown at you. And the kind of deadlines, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, 18 weeks, 20, 22 weeks, are in many ways very arbitrary. They're not based in medicine. They're actually based often in politics and sometimes in terms of morality. There's no reason why a woman can't have an abortion at 13 weeks. Why is there this deadline at 12 weeks? So that they're not usually they're not based in medical evidence. And I often think that an interesting way to look at that question is to turn it around. And instead of saying at what point would you allow a woman to have an abortion, is to ask the person, what woman would you force to continue a pregnancy against her will? Because that's essentially what you're saying. So what woman should be forced to continue on with an unwanted pregnancy? Because a lot of, I think, anti-abortion people just some kind of magically think that if a woman can't have an abortion, that suddenly all the reasons why she wanted one will just disappear and she'll be happy. She'll just go on with the pregnancy and it'll all work out. And we know that that is not actually what happens. And we know that women are so desperate sometimes to have abortions when they can't access them, is that they will go to extreme lengths to do that, to access abortion, putting their own health and their own lives at risk. So making abortion illegal at these very arbitrary time limits doesn't stop women having abortions. It usually just means it stops them having access to safe abortion. So I think that the best abortion law, if you like, is a blank piece of paper. I don't think abortion should be in the law, regulated by the criminal law. I think abortion is a decision that a woman should make in consultation with her doctor if that is appropriate. And all of the guidelines and all of the protections that stop me getting rogue heart transplants or whatever, rogue appendectomies, are there to protect women in terms of so that they get the best medical care that they need. So I don't see why there has to be this special area of law when it comes to abortion. So I think it is a private decision between a woman and her doctor, and I trust women to make the right decision in the circumstances in which they find themselves. Personally speaking.
Can I just say that trust thing I think is really important in this, because I mentioned that there's a 24-week limit in UK law, but that limit doesn't apply when there is a serious fetal anomaly. And I remember just after I had given birth, I gave birth to my son. He wasn't premature, he was 2 weeks early. I gave birth at 38 weeks, and I was working in the area that I'm in now, and the abortion statistics had just been published. So I'm out of hospital, I've got my son and all of that, looking at the abortion stats, and I noticed that one of these late fetal anomaly cases was a woman who had had an abortion at 36 weeks. And that was just 2 weeks before I had had my son. I really kind of, oh my God, because it's like you're enormous, you're really feeling the fetal movement and so on. And it really made me think about, so what was going through that woman's mind at the time? Because either, you don't know anything about her, but either you decide she is the most reckless, amoral, unthinking, brutal woman who just doesn't care, or alternatively you think, what has happened in that woman's life? What anomaly is she dealing with? What are her circumstances that have really driven her to that? And eventually, how you end up feeling about it actually depends on what you think about the women. And one of the things that I learned looking into this later on is that, you know, there are some women who will, if they know that their baby is going to die on being born, they will hang on to that pregnancy until the last possible moment because they feel that they are protecting that fetus. So what I would say is just don't rush to judge why women have late abortions. Think about the circumstances that they might be up against, because that trusting women thing that you say is so important.
I would offer two things on that. One is hypotheticals are hypotheticals, right? And so in the United States, if you poll people, do you think, you know, women should have abortions post 20 weeks? The answer is frequently no, because who thinks about abortions post 20 weeks? But one interesting thing happened a couple of summers ago in the United States. You guys might recall that we had a Zika pandemic in southern states. And Zika cannot be detected until much later in pregnancy. And we started to see swings of public opinion in Florida, in Texas, in Mississippi, places where all of a sudden anybody could think, this is not diagnosis, it's a horrible diagnosis. It's terrifying for the fetus and the mother. And all of a sudden you had people thinking, oh, if this is me, I want to be making this decision with my personal medical charts in front of me, not with what some politician who has no idea what my circumstances are. And so it was just this very stark reminder that what feels hypothetical to us is not actually hypothetical when you're going through it. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the fact that trust women as a mantra in the United States was coined by a doctor by the name of Dr. George Tiller, who provided abortions compassionately to women until he was gunned down in the pews of his church by an anti-abortion terrorist in 2009. It has not been that long. It's been barely 10 years since he was murdered in his church for providing abortions.
So for one final question from me before we move on to some questions from the audience, do you think that abortion is a women's rights issue? Do you think that it's a gendered issue?
A gendered issue?
Yeah.
Fascinating. I think that, I'm not sure I understand the question.
So do you think that it's, you know, an issue for only women to be concerned about? Do you think it's no?
I don't. I don't, and we have, you know, one of our fastest growing movements in the United States is what we call our Men for Choice movement, where increasingly, you know, men have certainly wanted to engage because this is seen as a human rights issue, first and foremost. I think it's much like Sinead and Anne are saying, that, you know, the opposite of having access to abortion is forced pregnancy. Forced pregnancy has been defined by the UN as torture. And the idea that anyone should be forced to do anything with themselves and their body against their will that is life-determining, life-changing, I think, you know, we are certainly embracing that in the United States as a human right. And when you see it as a human right, it's impossible for it not to become a fight for everyone. And I think that's different than what it was when Roe versus Wade was passed. We have sort of this argument between second wave and third and fourth wave feminists in the United States, where Roe very much was seen as a women's independence thing. There was not a lot of invitation for men to be involved. And I think, you know, feminism is no longer a gendered thing in the United States. Certainly more and more men, particularly millennial men, are identifying as feminists, recognizing that they are not liberated. They are bound by the patriarchy in the same way that, not in the same way, in a different way, but in a way that is not liberating to them. You know, if feminism is not embraced as the essence of gender equality and gender equity and And you can't actually embrace gender equity if you don't embrace abortion rights as a human right.
I don't know what wave I am anymore. I've kind of lost the plot in terms of the various different waves in one way or another. I mean, I think it's, you know, you have to have a womb to get pregnant, and ultimately the decision is going to be that person, you know. She is going to carry the child, be delivered of it, you know. Having said that, I think it is hugely important, we were talking about this before the meeting, I think it is hugely important for men to have views on this and to take a stance on it. I'm really old-fashioned. I strongly believe in this principle of solidarity, that you do not have to be the identity of what you think is important. And if men feel, as I want them to, that women should have the right to decide and have the ability to exercise their autonomy to make decisions about their lives, they should be standing with us. And the amazing thing is how many couples come to abortion clinics. I mean, you'll find this in the US, and you know, men are there with their partners, and typically they have come to a decision together about it. And we don't do ourselves any favors, I think, to try and imagine that there's a dividing line down the middle. I just don't see that. I see people come to decisions together, and very often the guys are kind of hacked off because, and the women actually are hacked off because we always see the women at some point on her own. And the men are kind of, I want to be there too, you know, I'm kind of part of this, and they see that they have a stake in the pregnancy, but that doesn't mean they want to override the woman's position with it.
Yeah, I think in Ireland, for very specific historical reasons, the struggle for abortion rights is sometimes framed in terms of the question about women's rights and women's equality. And that is, I think, for very specific historical reasons, because women in Ireland have borne for so many decades this kind of almost kind of theocratic state that Ireland was for such a long time. And women who did not conform to this particular version of Irish womanhood, which meant that you were married and you had children, you had many, many children. And if you failed to conform to that, you either went into exile, you left, you went to Britain, or you went to America, or you were put into a Magdalen laundry, or you were put into a mother and baby home. And those babies that were then born in those homes were either exported to North America, to essentially, in terms of a baby adoption market that went on that was organised by the Catholic Church, or they were put into orphanages, and where the infant mortality rate was 5 times the national average. And this was even in a country that had a very high mortality rate in the 1950s. And then those babies died, and as we learned in the last couple of years, the bodies of those dead babies were thrown down a well and forgotten about. And they were only discovered because of the fearless work of a woman called Catherine Corliss, who went doggedly for years and discovered the 800 plus babies, bodies of a baby down a well in the Tuam mother and baby homes. So that's the kind of country that you're coming from, and that Ireland is only really beginning to kind of emerge out of that. So sometimes I think for those particular reasons, it is framed in those in terms of women's rights. But I think it is broader than that for the reasons that have already been said. I think most people, men and women, accept that this is good, not just for women, but for society as a whole. That when women are recognised as equal citizens, as equal participants in society. That's good not only for women, but it's good for society as a whole. Just like I would say that I do not want to live in a society that is racist. I don't think that's good for anybody. Of course, it affects people of colour far more than it will ever affect me. But I want to live in a society where everybody is respected, regardless of their race, their gender, or their sexuality. And that is, I think, good for everybody. And I think more and more people are beginning to recognise that. So it is increasingly, as people have said, been framed within a human right, I suppose, is a good way to think about it.
Thank you. I think now's probably the perfect time to open up some questions from the audience. So if you've got a question, please raise your hand and we'll try to get a microphone over to you. So I see a question just in the aisle, just there. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much for coming to speak to us. So I've heard a couple of representations tonight about what the other side or anti-abortion advocates advocate for, and I did some very cursory research, so forgive me if it's not very thorough, but it seems that this isn't an insignificant portion of the population. There was a Comres poll recently that only 1% of people in the UK favor extending abortion up to birth, and many of them were women who don't support this. Similarly, 7 in 10 women are in favor of reduction for the time restrictions. And similar statistics in the U.S. show that about 50% of people identify as pro-life. And I'm just wondering if you think that this ought to be part of the conversation, that we shouldn't just be having conversations about how to spread abortion rights, but about whether that's really what our countries are moving towards and whether that's where we want to go. Thank you.
Yes, I think we should be, frankly, I think we should be having conversations with everybody about this. And, you know, I know that this union has hosted at least 2 debates on the pro-choice, pro-life issue, because I've spoken at 2, and many of you will know I relish the opportunity to engage with people whose views are different to mine. What I would say is that I think that very often what these opinion polls do is to polarize discussion in a way that doesn't really relate to the issue that's in hand. And I think that, as Elise has mentioned, if you ask people, is 20 weeks too high for someone to have an abortion, people will probably say, yes, it is. If you say, should the abortion time limit be reduced, then the answer may well be yes, it should. Certainly, if you ask someone, should women be able to choose to have abortions up to birth? You know, the answer will probably be they should not be allowed to have abortions up to birth. But then when you talk about the specific examples, and indeed even on the broad moral issues, when you start to unpick it, and you think about what really lies behind the questions, you can have a much more subtle and rich discussion about it. So I do think we should be engaging, but I also think it's really good to be able to have a nuanced discussion that assumes that abortion is legal once in a while. We can allow ourselves that luxury.
And I appreciate the question because it's something we actually discuss a lot in the States. One of the really interesting things when you unpack that number is absolutely, if you ask people if they're pro-life or pro-choice, it splits about 50-50. If you go on to say, okay, regardless of your personal views, do you believe that the government should intervene in your neighbor's decision? Or it's 70% and above that say, no, a majority of people who say I'm personally pro-life have much more complicated views about what they think should be criminalized and what the government should do. So I agree with Anne, it's in the nuance. And one of the things you hear frequently in the United States, abortion providers say is that most people, not everyone, but most people will express that they have 3 exceptions, even if they are personally anti-abortion. And it's most often life of the mother, rape frequently, and me. And that's what they'll tell you. And abortion providers will tell you stories of, we have many, many protesters at clinics across the United States, of protesters that are there every week, and almost all of them will say at least once around the back door, a protester will show up, either for herself or her daughter, because everybody has a story, and everybody thinks that they are the exception, and everyone thinks, I know what's best for me, even if I don't trust you to know what's best for you. And I think that is the question. Yes, we should have the conversations, but at the end of the day, the ultimate question is, am I comfortable being judge and jury for everyone else, even if I don't know their circumstances? And am I comfortable with the consequences of being judge and jury? Because as Sinead was saying, in the United States, we don't have women not actually going through with it. We have women hurting themselves and going to jail because they can't access that. And that's an entirely different moral and ethical question that must be dealt with at the same time as whether we want to criminalize abortion.
Yeah, I mean, I also agree with that. I mean, I live in a country in which the law is an incredibly blunt instrument, in that you can access abortion if you're dying, and if you're not, you can't. That's the law in Ireland. Now, we've seen exceptions to that. If you have money and you have the ability to travel, you can access abortion. But I think most people are now recognizing that blunt instrument of making abortion illegal doesn't work. And I suppose where we are in the conversation at the moment is in that kind of nuanced area where finally Irish society has to have that conversation about the complexity that it is. People have all sorts of opinions and very strong personal feelings on that. And I respect somebody who is against abortion. If they're personally against abortion, I respect that position that they hold. But it's one thing to say that this is where these are my personal beliefs. It's quite another thing to ask the law to reflect your personal beliefs, and to say that someone who does not agree with my particular personal beliefs should face a prison sentence of up to 14 years, because that's essentially what you're saying. And the problem with the law is that it becomes this very blunt instrument that doesn't deal with the complexity of abortion, because anti-abortionists always talk about women and abortions, but it's not women or abortions, it's a woman who has an abortion. And that woman has her own set of circumstances, and it is in the complexity and the nuances and sometimes the mess that she decides to have an abortion in those particular circumstances. And the law can't accommodate for that. And I think that's where the problem lies. So by taking the law out of it, I think that's how you can accommodate the complexity of the situation.
Mm-hmm. You know, I've got quite a lot of respect for Jacob Rees-Mogg, who I know has been generally reviled in the British media for making this point. He's one of the contenders for our Conservative Prime Minister's seat. And he's very traditional. He's a very traditional Catholic. And he made the point when he was asked that he completely disapproves of abortion, even in cases of rape. He's absolutely 100% opposed to abortion. You have to make the point, well, at least he's intellectually consistent about it. He's not doing well, I'm concerned about the rights of the embryo, you know, but not in these circumstances. But actually, the reason why I've got quite a lot of time for him, I'm not saying that I'd vote for him, you know. I just want to be clear about that. Given that this is going on video, I just want to be clear. But, you know, he did make the point that that was his own personal view, and that it wasn't a view that he thought should be a matter for the law of the land. And so, you know, you can sort of separate it out, I think, a little bit on this. But yeah, I'd love to have a conversation with him about what he thinks about it.
I think we've maybe got time for one more quick question then. Fortunately, so no pressure, but a hand just there.
So thank you so much for coming, and especially for the important work that you're doing. One thing that I'm so curious about is in all three of your countries, there seems to be enormous progress on all kinds of social rights. So whether it's LGBT rights or, you know, more people than ever identifying with feminist movements, and we're seeing all kinds of equal rights campaigns, and yet abortion rights are either stagnating or regressing. And I'm just curious why. Why, and sort of like how can we harness the energies of these other movements towards abortion?
I think, this is just my opinion, I think that here it's because we haven't done very effectively what the person at the back was just saying, which is to really engage with the arguments across the whole spectrum, and I think particularly to take up some of the moral arguments around abortion and to get off the back foot and to say this is actually about enabling people to make decisions about their own lives. It's about issues about where the state ends its power over your life and where you take your own private control of it. And it's about enabling people to have control over their future and determine what's best for them. And I think that we have been far too much on the back hoof of basically saying, oh well, you know, it's, you know, wrong but the right thing to do in certain circumstances. And I think that the one thing that we should learn is that abortion is necessary for people's lives. It can be the right decision for women to make, and we shouldn't really need to apologize for it and really move forward in that way. And the reason why I think that's important is because if you look at countries, many of the Eastern European countries at the moment, where what they're trying to do is to they're looking at their constitutions and they're inserting clauses about what their national moral framework should be in the family, and those are almost being exclusively prohibitive, whereas I think that we should make our morality about keeping the state out of various aspects of our lives and establishing boundaries of where we have our own individual power. It's about redefining and reframing that conversation, but that's just my own personal view on how we should win on it. It's different in different countries.
I sometimes think that it's very easy to stand up and say that you're pro-life because you don't actually have to do anything. Like for a politician, I'm saying, I'm not talking about an individual. A politician can stand up and say that they're pro-life. They don't actually have to do anything. It doesn't actually require anything of them because the whole responsibility for that is put onto the individual woman. And when you actually, I think, begin to think about if you really, really believe that you're pro-life and you want somebody to make the choice to have a child, that actually does require an enormous amount of the state because it requires an education system, it requires a healthcare system, it requires housing, it requires an entire social apparatus in order for that to be a real and positive choice. Because the vast majority of women who choose to have abortions are often mothers, as we said already. And I know in terms of research that's been done in Ireland, one of the reasons they decide not to have another child is because they can't afford to. So the kind of typical stereotype that we have is the kind of feckless teenager who's had unprotected sex is not actually the reality of it. So to actually have a child and to support women making that choice involves an awful lot more than kind of these empty promises will support you through your pregnancy. It's about, I think, asking what type of society that we live in. And at the same time, I think there's a kind of interesting parallel to be made between the kind of the growth of neoliberalism and austerity throughout the world, which is actually pushing back on those very social needs that we all have in terms of welfare, housing, health, education, and putting more and more of the responsibility of that onto the individual families as jobs and wages and all of those vital things are in decline. So I think there is, I'm not maybe sure exactly I think we need to maybe think it through a little bit more, but I do think that there is a connection between the kind of neoliberal agenda, on the one hand, that valorizes choice, it tells you it's all about choices, but at the same time narrows the choices that you can make depending on your financial circumstances.
I mean, it's interesting that Anne said, I think it's different in every country, and I think some things are and some things aren't. In the United States, you know, we certainly have a Catholic population, but it's a relatively small part of the population, and even some of our most venerated Catholic elected officials, like Mario Cuomo, if you've heard that name, went to Notre Dame, which is, of course, the big Catholic university, and argued that as a personally pro-life elected official, he was ethically obligated to govern in a pro-choice manner because the very fabric of democracy actually rests on the idea that we can separate our own individual ideology from public policy and what is best for the common good. We have a weird situation in the United States, which is really the evangelical movement, which is what Mike Pence is part of, is the grassroots of the anti-abortion movement. And they were actually not anti-abortion. The evangelical movement in the United States was mobilized to political power to fight school desegregation. They really wanted to invoke this idea of religious liberty to keep their children from having to go to school with black children. And it was after they lost that fight, and ironically, after the Equal Rights Amendment failed, and so you had the Eagle Forum and Phyllis Schlafly, so they literally got on a conference call and were like, we need another issue. Popcorn, people, popcorn, what are some issues? And somebody on the call said, what about abortion? And they were like, let's do it. Seriously. And this is how you can, W.A. Criswell, who was the leading fundamentalist at the time of Roe, put out a public statement affirming Roe the day after it came out. The Convention on Southern Baptists in 1976 lauded Roe. So it's a very different sort of situation than what you guys have, with a consistent posture, even if it's one I disagree with, of the Catholic Church through time. So it's been instrumentalized in a way that for political power and political gain. The way that I think that we are going to combat that effectively, and where I think we've gone wrong in the past, quite honestly, and this is where we have learned a lot in the States from what we call the reproductive justice movement, which is the intersectional feminist movement, primarily led by women of color in the United States, is that separating abortion out as an issue doesn't always do the best service to it, right? It is one piece of a woman's life, and that when we actually integrate it into a fight for justice and equality that does involve better we have horrible maternal mortality in the United States. We have horrible access to children's health care, and that the reproductive justice movement sees abortion rights as part of a continuum that is really about seeking justice, regardless of your financial status, regardless of your race or ethnicity or sexual orientation. And I think as we have learned to reintegrate the fight for abortion rights within a broader fight for social justice, we see we are gaining more power. You can't separate it out because it is the nucleus of autonomy and self-determination. But I think it was always best intended. The social movements and the social fabric will best support abortion rights when it's seen as part of a continuum in a woman and a family's lives, and not as something separate over here.
So unfortunately that's all we've got time for this evening, but if we could all please join me in thanking the panellists for joining us tonight.